Hi everyone. So I just wanted to record a quick little video that goes over some more aspects of biodiversity. So we are going to cover human influences in particular, and you'll note down here this HIPPCO. So pay attention to the letters. It's a little mnemonic to help you remember the various things that influence biodiversity. Okay, so one thing to think about with biodiversity is as biodiversity is decreasing, what we're really starting to think about is, okay, what's happening to the species? So we're starting to think about species extinction. And extinction is when you lose the species basically altogether. So the species no longer exist over the whole globe. Extirpation is when they basically go extinct in just a local area, but there might be a population somewhere else, okay? And something to keep in mind as we go through this is that extinction and new species being formed is a natural process. So there's always some species going extinct and some rate of new species that are being formed through evolution. And we think that that background rate is about one per either somewhere in between 1 to 10 million species per year. So that's the natural rate. But we've noticed if you look through the fossil record that there are times when there's been these mass extinction episodes where it seems like a lot of species are going extinct at around the same time. All right. And one thing to consider is, given everything that's happening now, what are we seeing happening to extinction rates right now? And so a lot of biologists are actually thinking that we are in the midst of a sixth extinction event. And this one is different in that it's human caused. So you can think about that a little bit as we go through the different causes of this loss of biodiversity. But we know that current rates seem to be higher than normal. And one thing that keeps track of whether animals or organisms are endangered is this red list. So that's the World Conservation Union. And then in the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act, which helps to protect endangered species. Okay, so remember I said there's 5 extinction events. So this is basically showing on the y-axis is number of families. So remember in our categories, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family. That's where we're at. So we're looking at number of families and millions of years ago. And so this makes sense because we're starting out, evolution's occurring, new species are forming. And so we have the Ordovician extinction, the Devonian extinction. This Permo-Triassic was probably the biggest extinction event. And then we have End-Triassic, and then the Cretaceous Tertiary. So this is sometimes referred to as the KT extinction event. And this is the extinction event that got rid of most of the dinosaurs. So I'm going to say except birds that made it through. So hopefully you remember from intro bio that birds are actually dinosaurs. So anyway, you don't have to know these 5 names. I just think it's kind of interesting. We think that this dinosaur extinction event was actually an asteroid that hit off the coast of Mexico. And it was so big that it threw up all these debris into the atmosphere. And so it basically caused climate change very quickly, and that's what did in the dinosaurs. So just kind of a little bits of information. But if we look at what's happening now, all right, this is the Living Planet Index. So it's an indicator of the status of global biodiversity. So overall, so if you look at the Living Planet Index, that's the black line, that fell about 50%. So the caption says 52%. All right. And then you can sort of break that down into different things. So terrestrial, marine, and then it looks like freshwater showed the biggest decrease. And this is just from 1970 to 2010. So this is just over a 40-year period. So clearly something is going on right now. All right. One thing to think about as we think about, well, what species are going to go extinct is there generally are some winners and losers. So the winners tend to be what we call generalists. So these are animals that have a pretty wide range of environments they can live in. So they can maybe eat lots of different foods. They can adapt, if it's cold, it's hot. They're very good at sort of taking advantage of whatever's there. All right, and I always think of generalists as your basic rat. So rats are very good at surviving because they're good at coping with rapidly changing conditions. They have a high reproductive rate. They don't need a large range of habitat, so they're very good at surviving in cities, for example. The losers tend to be your specialists. These are animals that have maybe a more limited diet. They have more special needs, so they have a very particular niche. So they tend to be limited to a particular range. They need stable, unchanging conditions. They tend to be larger and more slowly reproducing. So if the population falls, it's harder to bring it back. And they also need large areas of habitat. So we talked a little bit about tigers and what's happening to them, for example. Okay, so what are these human influences? So remember HIPPCO. So H stands for habitat alteration, and this is the greatest cause of biodiversity loss, at least right now. Now we think as climate change kind of becomes more of a problem that may actually take over, but right now we're sort of considering habitat alteration as the greatest cause. And an example of this is the Great Plains. So in the US, if you think of the Midwest to sort of the middle of the country, that's all areas where there's a lot of agriculture and farming. Well, that was originally prairie. So that was originally grassland habitat. All right, think bison and prairie dogs. And things like that. Well, now we've converted most of that to farmland. That's our most productive farmland. And so now there's less than 1% of the original prairie habitat remaining. And so if there's not that habitat anymore, you obviously are going to lose a lot of species that live there. So, for example, bird populations have decreased maybe 82 to 99%. All right. And one thing to think about this is it's not just getting rid of habitats, but it's also when you start fragmenting it. So this diagram is showing we are sort of cutting away more and more chunks. And so these become sort of isolated island of habitats that are not connected to each other. And so this can make it difficult for populations to interbreed and sort of share their genetics. It can make edge effects more apparent, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. One are invasive species, and so you're going to investigate Maryland invasive species in a bit, but invasive species in general are what we call exotic. So they're usually species that have arrived from somewhere else, and they have basically thrived in their new environment. So they then threaten the native species. Okay, so not all exotic species are going to be invasive, but oftentimes this is what happens. So these are some examples. This is a starling. So starlings were brought to New York City. The story is that they were brought by someone to Central Park because he wanted all the birds in Shakespeare's plays to be in Central Park. I just recently saw that might not be true, but I think it's a good story. Lionfish have recently invaded the Caribbean and the east coast of the United States. I think they're up to the Carolinas now. And we think that actually happened from an accidental release from somebody's aquarium. So this is a Pacific fish that's now in the Caribbean, and these spines are poisonous. And so things that try to eat it might run into problems. And B, it's turned out that this is a voracious eater. So it's eating all kinds of small fish, anything basically that it can stuff into its mouth. So this is becoming more and more of a problem on coral reefs. This is the gypsy moth. So that's an example of an insect that, for instance, It actually affects a few types of trees, but primarily oaks. And then snakes are often invasive species. And Florida right now is having a problem in the Everglades with pythons that have been released, because the Everglades are, again, nice place for a tropical snake. And the animals that live there are not used to dealing with this, right? So there's no natural predators for these invasive species, which adds to the problem. All right, pollution, that's pretty apparent. It could be something like air pollution, toxic chemicals, things that just decrease health, decrease lifespan. Plastic pollution, especially in the ocean, is becoming more and more of a problem because animals think this is food. And so we're seeing a lot of birds and sea mammals and turtles, for instance, that when they're found dead, they have a lot of plastic in their stomachs. So that's a problem. Human population. So this kind of contributes to the other things, but if you look, this is a map where the red to purple dots are showing high populations. And so notice, remember our tiger story? Well, here's India and China. All right, so there's a lot of people that live there. So as we take over more of the habitat, less resources available for the ecosystems. And so you can also see Europe. Here's parts of America, parts of South America, and parts of Africa that are becoming highly populated. And we'll talk about this in our own unit. So we're going to do a unit on population growth, but just for now, sort of realize that human populations, as we grow, we take up more of that ecological footprint. That means there's less left over for other organisms. Climate change. So we've talked a little bit about climate change and the different types of impacts that can have, droughts, more forest fires, floods, changing precipitation patterns, etc. And so what this means for a lot of animals and plants is that they're going to have to shift their ranges. So for instance, as things increase, let's say it gets warmer, well, plants and animals might have to move north. And as they move north, well, what about the plants and animals that live there already? Are they displacing them? Are you setting up sort of new food chains? What's going on there? So you'll have a situation where there's different prey, predators, maybe different parasites. One of the things that might expand its range are mosquitoes. So as summers get warmer and winters get warmer, mosquitoes can extend their range. And that includes some mosquitoes that carry things like malaria. So that's a problem. And for a lot of plants and animals and organisms, it really is, can the population adapt quickly enough? And if it can't, then that population is going to die out. And so some organisms, some populations, maybe that have more variety, they'll be able to adapt, and others won't. And finally, over harvesting. So this is things like hunting and fishing. And fishing, this is an example of the Atlantic cod stocks, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about water resources. But basically, off the coast of New England, fishing for cod was really a way of life for a lot of people. And there were more cod than people ever thought you could possibly fish out, right? And if you look at, here's fish landing, so that means how much you're taking in tons. And it's kind of, steady increase. And then look what happens around 1960. You have this huge explosion. So this is, we're getting better ways of fishing, right? It's more industrialized. We have sonar that can locate the fish schools. We are better at capturing them. And so the landings go way up. And people are thinking, well, since we're catching this many fish, there must be a lot of fish. But really, we're just getting really good at catching fish. And so you can see it drop off, and then it kind of rebounds. But then look at this last drop off. So between the late 80s, early 90s, it's almost a sudden decrease to almost zero. And so they actually did apply a moratorium. And so that basically said you can't fish in these waters anymore. And it was really a contentious issue. As I said, people are making their living off this, but that was literally a last resort because the fish stocks were so low. The problem is that the Atlantic cod has not rebounded. So people thought if they didn't fish it, it would rebound. So the possibility is maybe if we let it get too low, then those populations can't recover anymore. Maybe new fish take over that niche, or maybe there's just not enough reproducing adults to make a viable population. So we're still sort of watching what's going to happen to that cod population. All right, just a few little odds and ends. One thing that we think about is we sort of look at what we call indicator species. So I always call this the canary in the coal mine, but people aren't as familiar with this anymore. But if you ever watch like an old Western movie, you know, they took the canaries, so they had a bird cage down in the coal mines. And this was because if gases were released, the canary would die first. So if the canary died, you knew to get out of the mine. So what we're looking at is, okay, which organisms do we think are most susceptible to some of these changes and what's happening to their population? And amphibians are definitely an indicator species. So they have thin skin, so they're probably going to be affected by pollution because things can diffuse. They live in areas where habitat destruction is occurring. They are both on land and in the water, so they're going to have impacts from both. And unfortunately, we're seeing really drastic declines in a lot of amphibian species. And so this is caused, they've been getting a disease, a fungal disease called chytrid that we think has been taking out a lot of frogs. We've seen frog deformities. Habitat loss has been big. So this could be indicating something bad. Okay, so one thing I just want to briefly circle back to a little bit. Remember when we were talking about habitat fragmentation, and I said it was like we get little islands of habitat? Well, it turns out when you look at real islands, there's this island biogeography theory that's telling us how many species islands can support. And so there are basically three factors. One is the distance effect. So the closer the island is to the mainland, the more species. The easier it is to get over there with enough numbers to establish a colony. So more species colonize islands close to the mainland. All right, the target size. So how big is the island? So bigger islands are going to be able to support more species over time because there's more resources, there's more niches, there's basically more places and roles for each of those organisms to occupy. And then the third thing is when we look at what happens to extinction rates, it also turns out that proportionately fewer species go extinct on larger islands. And again, it's just if you have more to start with, right, and some event occurs, you're going to end up with more species than you would on a smaller island. So the likelihood of more species becoming extinct is going to be greater on a smaller island. So this happens on islands, and what ecologists did is they said, oh, well, this probably applies when we're thinking of those islands, let's say, in forested areas where we've sort of made these habitat fragments that are now separated from each other. So you have to ask, can animals go from one piece of habitat to the other? And we're going to talk about how conservationists are starting to approach thinking about that. Like, what do you do? Okay, you can't save the whole area, but maybe you can make corridors between these fragments, or thinking about how big does the fragment have to be. So we'll kind of come back to this, but I wanted to introduce it now. Okay, and here's just some data looking at number of species on the island and the area. So as the island gets bigger, just note, we'll come back to this too, that this is a log scale. So we go 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000. That helps you put large ranges on a scale much easier. But it's showing that as we increase the size of the island, we increase the number of species. So this is a positive correlation. Okay, I just made it under 20 minutes. I meant to be faster. Sorry for babbling on, but I hope this helps, and I'll see you in class.